creating whether we know it or not. Whether we take responsibility or not, we're still creating our reality. So we don't get to fall asleep at the wheel. I mean, actually we do get to fall asleep at the wheel, but we still create, even though we're asleep at the wheel. That's the problem. We're asleep at the wheel and we're creating this mess, right? One of the things that I wanted to talk a little bit about today is the idea of responsibility. There's this story. There's this man, and he's walking through the forest. And he's been walking for a number of days because he's on a great big long hike. And he decides to sit down underneath a beautiful kalpataru tree. A kalpataru tree is a wish-fulfilling tree. And he sits down underneath this tree, and he's thinking to himself, wow, I've had such a wonderful walk over the last several days. And, you know, I've got my backpack with all my food, and I'm kind of bored of my food. So I'm just really wishing I had a beautiful spread of you know, meats and different types of cheeses and olives and some, you know, really nice crackers and maybe a little bit of red wine and, you know, maybe something sweet at the end, like maybe some chocolate cake or something like that. And he's kind of thinking about that, and before he can even finish his thought, you know, poof, right in front of him is a beautiful spread of exactly the things that he was talking about. So he finishes this scrumptious meal, and he's sitting there kind of in amazement that it even kind of seemed to appear out of nowhere. And he's thinking, wow, that lunch was absolutely like scrumptious, and I wished I had a beautiful, soft bed that I could lie under this gorgeous tree and just have a nice afternoon nap. And so before he can even finish thinking that full thought, boof, right in the middle of the forest is this beautiful bed underneath this wonderful tree, and he thinks, wow, I wonder where that came from. So he lays on the bed and he's kind of getting himself all comfortable, getting ready for his nap, and he kind of thinks to himself like, gee, I wonder what would happen if I thought about a bear coming and eating me. And a bear came and ate him. So probably not exactly the ending of the story that you would expect. But the point of this story is that we're all under a kalpataru tree. We're all under a wish-fulfilling tree. Because that's what the universe is. Whatever we put out there as our thoughts, we get showered with. So that's why it's so relevant and important to be very conscious and self-aware of, not insecure about, but self-aware of, what are we putting out to the universe? Because whatever we put out there gets listened to very carefully and delivered to us. And so that's the concept of responsibility, or that's the foundation from which the need and or the desire for responsibility shows up. Because we want to be able to create what we want with our thoughts rather than unconsciously going through life with a bunch of thoughts that maybe we're not even aware that they're running us, and yet the universe is still responding to those thoughts, even though we're not aware of them. The idea of responsibility then, as I think I mentioned before, can kind of feel like a bit of a weight, you know, like a bit of a weight on our shoulders. It's like, oh my God, you know, now I got to think about every thought that I'm having and what that means, and you know, and all that, you know, suddenly there's this sort of heaviness about it. And it's like, well, we can take it as a sort of heaviness, or we can see it as the huge opportunity that it can be. Because now we get to create whatever it is that we want to create in our life, starting with the thoughts that will make that happen. And so that's sort of the essence of the concept of taking responsibility. and really being clear that whether we take responsibility or not, we are still creating our life through the thoughts that we think. And so we can say, you know, I'm not going to take any responsibility for this stuff because that's just not, you know, that's not the life I'm creating. Well, lo and behold, we are creating that life. And so the opportunity then is to become very, very purposeful about the sort of life that we want to create. And we become purposeful by having the thoughts that support the type of reality that we want to create. Because once again, the stream is thoughts become words, words become actions, actions becomes life, and life becomes what we call our reality. But it all starts with our thoughts. Anything, I mean, if you literally stop and look around the room, your room for a moment, at anything that you can point to, it started as a thought. You know, if you look over at your oven or your stove or your dishwasher or your sink or the kitchen table or the cupboards, it all started as a thought. And it's interesting how we can so easily understand that, because we can go, well, of course it started as a thought, because someone had to design what that cupboard looked like and the size of the cupboard and how many shelves it would have and where all the screws would go and the holes for the screws. And so it's very easy when we look at something physical like a piece of machinery or a stereo or a dresser drawers or anything like that. It's very easy for us to say, of course those physical things started with a thought, because you had to have some designer or some engineer who had to think up what that thing was going to look like. Well, guess what? We're the designer and the engineer for our life. Every thought we have is becoming reality. And so it's such an opportunity, really, to come to terms with that idea that there's not anything that we can look at in our life that somehow we didn't think, first of all. And therefore, there's nothing that we can't create through exactly the same process of being intentional about our thoughts. So if we want to create misery, we can create misery. If we want to create ecstatic joy, we can create ecstatic joy. It really is up to us. And that's the beauty of it all. I can sometimes, for sure, go to the place of, but I don't want to have to be responsible for all that stuff. But then when I start to not wanting to take responsibility, and I see what that creates, because you see, we're creating whether we know it or not, whether we take responsibility or not, we're still creating our reality. So we don't get to fall asleep at the wheel. I mean, actually we do get to fall asleep at the wheel, but we still create, even though we're asleep at the wheel. That's the problem. We're asleep at the wheel and we're creating this mess, right? So the opportunity then is to really embrace the idea of creating what it is that we really, really desire in our life. And that's the power and the opportunity of being self-aware and consciously creating the thoughts, words, actions that determines our life and creates the reality that we want to create.